Clarence Webb inherited a bait shop worth $2,100. His son walked away with the argument, the paperwork, and the plan to sell everything before the month was out. He drove there alone, with a thermos of black coffee and the same rubber boots he'd worn on the water for 40 years. What he found under the floorboards of that old shop had been sitting there for 28 years, and the man who built it had never once written his own name on a single page of it. Clarence Webb was 72 years old, and the morning his son signed the power of attorney in the back room of a law office on Commerce Street, Clarence walked out with his hat in his hand, his truck keys, and the deed to a bait and tackle shop on Water Street that had not sold a thing in 3 years. Derek got the house on 9th Avenue, appraised at $204,000. He got the savings account their father had built over 40 years of commercial fishing, and the 1987 Alumacraft still in dry dock behind the marina. He got the life insurance payout, the tools in the carport, and the motor on the flatbed that Elton Webb had rebuilt 3 times with his own hands before the arthritis made that impossible. Clarence got $2,100 and a building with a leaking roof. He did not say anything when the attorney read the figures aloud. He sat in the chair across from Whitfield's desk and listened the way he had listened to weather reports for 40 years. Not with hope, not with dread, just with attention. The kind of attention that lets you know when something true is being said and when something is being managed. Derek had leaned forward during the reading. He had nodded at certain numbers. He had looked over at Clarence twice, the way a man looks when he expects to be challenged and has already prepared the response. Clarence did not challenge anything. He signed where the attorney pointed. 3 signatures, 1 initial. His hand was steady. He had worked commercial fishing out of Apalachicola Bay for 31 years, and before that, he had crewed on a shrimper out of East Point from the time he was 17. He had learned to keep his hands steady in weather that would have made most men sit down on the deck and stop moving. That steadiness did not belong to him. It had been built by years, by cold water, by things that could not be undone. It simply was what it was. Derek drove him to the parking lot afterward and said, through the truck window, that he hoped Clarence understood it was nothing personal, that their father had just been realistic about the differences in their situations, that Derek had real debt, not the kind you chose, the kind that arrived whether you wanted it or not, and Elton had known that, had understood it, had made the decision that made the most sense for everyone. Clarence listened to this through the open window of his truck. Then he said, "I know." He started the truck. He pulled out of the lot. He did not say anything else because there was nothing else to say, and because a man who has spent enough years on the water learns quickly that the difference between what is and what should have been is not a conversation. It is a tide. It moves. It does not ask permission. And arguing with it does not make you right. It only makes you wet. He drove south on Highway 98 with the windows down. The bay came into view around the bend, past the old oyster houses, wide and flat and grey-green in the early morning light. He had not lived here in 6 years, not since he and Miriam had moved up to Tallahassee after she got sick. And then, after she died, he had stayed, because moving again felt like it required a reason, and he had not been able to find one that held. But he knew this water. He knew the smell of it. He knew the way it looked in October when the wind shifted and the surface went quiet and the mullet started running, and every man who'd ever worked a net could feel it in his hands before he even stepped outside. He pulled into the gravel lot beside the shop and sat in the truck for a moment. The building had been his father's, and before that, it had been whatever was there before a fish house, a storage shed, some kind of structure that had been added onto and repaired and re-roofed so many times it was impossible to say what the original thing had been. The sign was still there. Webb's Bait and Tackle. White letters on green, sun-bleached enough now that you had to know what it said to read it. The front window had a crack, running from the lower left corner halfway to the top. Someone had taped it from the inside. Derek had told him the building was worth less than the lot. Clarence got out of the truck and put his hat on. The door was unlocked. It had always been unlocked. His father had said more than once that a man who locked his bait shop at night was a man who did not trust fishermen, and if you did not trust fishermen, then you had no business selling them bait. Clarence had never entirely agreed with this logic, but he had never been the one to change it. Inside, the shop smelled the same. 40 years, give or take, since he had first worked the counter here as a boy, and it still smelled the same salt and rubber, and the particular dusty, cold water smell of live bait tanks that had been running so long they had become part of the air. The tanks were empty now. The pumps were off. But the smell remained, the way smells do in old wood buildings, the way they get into the grain and stay there long after the thing that made them is gone. He walked the length of the counter without turning on the lights. He knew where everything was. The rod racks along the east wall, the tackle cases under glass, the shelf of leaders and hooks and sinker weights that his father had arranged by size, smallest to largest, left to right, and which had remained in exactly that order for as long as Clarence could remember. Someone had kept it up. He did not know who. Derek had not been here in years. But someone had swept the floor and kept the shelves organized and replaced the tape on the cracked window at some point in the recent past, because the tape still held cleanly. He stood behind the counter and looked at the room. This was where Elton Webb had stood every morning for 51 years. Behind this counter, in this light, looking at this same back wall with the same tide clock and the same hand-lettered sign that said, "Live shrimp when available." Clarence did not know what he was supposed to do with any of it. Derek's plan was simple: sell the building and the lot, pay down his debt, and move on. He had said this as if it were a plan they both had. As if Clarence's receipt of the deed was a formality, a step in a process that had already been decided. He had a buyer, he said, a developer from Jacksonville who was looking at the whole block. Not right away, but soon. A few months. Clarence just needed to sign one more thing. Clarence had not signed the one more thing. He had said he wanted to see the property first. Derek had said that was fine. That was completely fine. He understood Clarence should absolutely take a look. Just don't take too long about it, because the developer's interest wouldn't hold forever. That had been 6 days ago. Clarence had driven down the next morning and had been here every day since. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. He wasn't sure there was anything to look for. But something about the place felt unfinished, and he had learned a long time ago to pay attention to that feeling. On the water, it had kept him alive more than once. He did not think a bait shop held the same kind of urgency. But the feeling was the same, and he was not ready to leave until he understood it. He went to the back room and filled the thermos from the tap. The water was still running. He had checked and stood at the small window that looked out over the dock. The bay was calm. A pelican stood on a piling 30 yards out, exactly still, watching the water with the kind of patience that made everything else look impatient by comparison. Clarence watched it for a while. Then he went to find out what his father had left inside the floor. The shop had a specific kind of quiet that Clarence had not heard anywhere else in the 6 years since he had left Apalachicola. It was not peaceful quiet. It was not the quiet of a place that had been put to rest properly. It was the quiet of a place that had been interrupted mid-sentence, mid-motion, and had been waiting since then for someone to come back and finish the thought. He knew that quality in a room. He had known it in his own house in Tallahassee for months after Miriam died. the way a space that had always held two people continues to hold the shape of two people, even when one of them is gone. You move around the absence. You navigate it. You stop leaving the coffee maker set to make 2 cups, but it takes longer than it should. Here it was different. Here the absence was older and had more layers to it. He started in the back room. He pulled open every drawer in the filing cabinet, a 4-drawer olive green thing that looked like it had come out of a government office sometime around 1971. Purchase orders. Invoices. His father's handwriting on a folder of notes, the letters compressed and slightly tilted, the way Elton had always written. Tide tables going back to 1987. In the back of the bottom drawer, behind a box of paper clips, a small framed photograph. It was himself. 23 years old, maybe 24, standing on the dock behind this building with a red snapper on a gaff. The most serious expression he had ever seen on his own face. A young man who had not yet learned to look easy in front of a camera. His father must have taken it. He set it on top of the filing cabinet and went back to work. On the shelf above the work table, 3 large coffee cans. The first had bolts and washers. The second had bolt cutters, neatly coiled. The third held something he did not expect. A stack of envelopes, sealed, rubber-banded together. The rubber band long since melted into the paper so that it came apart when he touched it. No names on the fronts, no addresses. He set them on the work table and left them for the moment. He moved into the main shop. Every item on every shelf was a reference to something he remembered, and memory is slower than inventory. He reached for a spool of fluorocarbon leader and found himself standing still, not reading the label, thinking about the morning his father had shown him how to tie an Albright knot at this same counter, the knot coming apart 3 times before it held. His father's hands, patient and unhurried. He put the spool back. He moved on. And here is the thing about that morning that I keep coming back to now. Clarence was not looking for anything. He was just walking through a place that was about to stop being what it was. Doing the thing you do when something is ending and you are not ready to say so yet. Moving room to room, putting your hands on what was left. By mid-morning, he had made it through the tackle cases and was working on the rod racks when he heard the door. He did not turn around immediately. In this shop, in his experience, a man who came through the door in the morning was either a fisherman or a man who wished he still was, and either way, he did not require immediate attention. You let a man look first. You let him get his bearings. You asked him what he needed when he was ready to say. He heard the particular sound of someone settling into a chair. He turned then. Tommy Garland was sitting in the wooden chair beside the counter, the customer's chair, the one with the left rear leg slightly shorter than the others, so that it rocked if you shifted your weight wrong. He had a paper bag from the bakery on Avenue D, and he set it on the counter without ceremony. He said, "Figured you hadn't eaten." Clarence said, "I ate." Tommy said, "Then I figured you'd eat again." He opened the bag. 2 biscuits, the large ones, wrapped in wax paper. He set one on the counter toward Clarence and held the other and looked around the shop. Tommy Garland had been coming into this shop for 30 years. He had shown up the week Elton Webb started running it alone, bought bait, sat in that chair, and had not stopped. Not a close friend, the kind of man whose presence becomes a feature of a place, indistinguishable from the tide clock, or the rod racks, or the smell of the tanks. He had not, Clarence noticed, asked what Clarence was doing here. He had not asked about the estate, or about Derek, or about any of the things that people who had heard about the estate were asking. And people in this town had heard, because people in small coastal towns hear everything. And they heard it faster than Clarence had expected, and with considerably more detail than he had shared with anyone. Tommy ate his biscuit. Clarence ate the second one, standing at the counter. They did not talk for a while. Then Tommy said, without looking up, Your daddy kept this shop open 23 years after he could have retired, Clarence said. I know, Tommy said. I always figured there was a reason for that. He did not say what reason. He did not seem to require a response. He folded the wax paper from his biscuit into a neat square and put it in the bag, and set the bag beside the chair and looked at the tide clock on the wall. Clarence looked at the clock too. 10:14 a.m. Tide coming in. He picked up the pry bar he'd set in the corner on day one and had not touched since. He turned it in his hands, set it back down. He went back to work. Tommy left around 11, saying only that he would be back tomorrow and that if Clarence needed a hand moving anything heavy, he should call first, because Tommy's back was not what it had been. But he could still move a refrigerator if given enough warning. Clarence said he'd call. He went back to work. In the early afternoon, he found the problem he had been looking for without knowing he was looking for it. The floor. He had noticed it the first morning without registering it as something to investigate. A slight unevenness near the center of the main room. A soft give under his boots in one specific area. The kind of thing you attribute to age and settling and move past. But that afternoon, going over the floor with a flashlight to check the joists from underneath through the access panel in the back room, he found something else. The joists were fine. The subfloor was fine. The rot he had expected to find was not there, or not there in any quantity that explained the soft spot. What he found instead, when he shone the flashlight at the right angle, was a line, not a crack. A line. Clean, deliberate, running in a rectangle approximately 3 feet by 4 feet, tight to the grain of the old pine flooring, nearly invisible unless the light caught it at exactly the angle it was catching it now. He straightened up and walked out of the back room and stood over the spot. He had stood over this spot 100 times as a boy. He had stood over it, helping his father stack live bait buckets, sorting through frozen shrimp, counting down to closing time on slow August afternoons. He had stood over it and never seen what was there to see, because he had never looked with the right question. He knelt down. The boards were old heart pine, close-grained and dense, the color of dark honey. He ran his fingertips along the surface and found the line again. With his touch, a gap, thin as a saw kerf, precise. Whoever had cut it had done it cleanly, with care, and had stained the edges to match the surrounding floor, so that even at close distance, without the right angle of light, it disappeared. He went along the perimeter of the rectangle with his fingertip until he found the place where the gap was slightly wider. The corner. He pressed. Nothing moved. He tried the other corners. On the third one, there was a slight depression. Not a hinge, not a latch, just a place where the wood gave a fraction of an inch more than the wood beside it. He sat back on his heels and looked at it. Then he went to find something to work with. The hardware store on Market Street had what he needed. He bought a short pry bar and a set of steel hooks, the wide, flat kind, made for lifting floor sections. He bought a headlamp because the overhead light in the center of the shop was not bright enough, and he did not want to work by flashlight held in his teeth. He drove back to the shop. He sat in his truck in the gravel lot with the door open, the work light, and the pry bar on the seat beside him. The mullet were running. He could hear them in the channel. The particular surface break sound, quick and flat, that meant a school moving fast in shallow water. He had learned a long time ago that patience is not the same as delay. The crate had been down there for decades. 3 more minutes was not going to change what was inside. But arriving at a thing wrong, rushed, unprepared, not quite ready, that could change how you received it. He sat for 3 minutes. Then he put on the headlamp and went inside. The pry bar fit into the gap on the 3rd try. The first 2 tries, he couldn't get enough angle. The gap was too fine, the fit too exact. He switched to the flat hook and worked it along the perimeter first, breaking the paint seal that had built up along the edges over what must have been decades. It came away in flakes, the paint layers of it, grey-green and older grey-green underneath, back to a pale yellow that was probably the original colour of the shop's interior from sometime in the 1960s. When the seal was broken, he went back to the pry bar. The section lifted. Not easily, it was heavy, solid pine, and it fit so precisely that it resisted coming up even after the seal was broken, as though the whole thing had been measured and remeasured, and fitted with the patience of someone who intended it to last. But it lifted. He got it up 2 inches, and then got his fingers under the edge and lifted with both hands and set it to the side. He looked down. Below the floor, in a space approximately 3 feet deep between the joists, there was a wooden crate. Old, sealed with tar along the seams in the same way boats used to be sealed, the tar gone grey and hard, set on 2 runners that kept it off the dirt. Dry, completely dry, in a town built on a swamp, where moisture got into everything, into the walls, into the furniture, into your joints if you lived here long enough. He did not touch it yet. He knelt at the edge of the opening and looked at it with the headlamp and let himself understand what he was looking at. His father had put this here. Not in the last years. Not recently. The tar on the crate seams was old, the kind of old that does not happen in 10 years or even 20. And the fit of the floor section above it, the precision of it, the staining of the cut edges, the deliberateness of every detail. This had been built by a man with time and purpose and a long view of the future. A man who expected the right person to find it eventually. A man who had learned from a lifetime of fishing that patience is not the same as inaction, and that the most important things you leave behind are the things you put in the ground long before anyone knows to look for them. What Clarence found when he lifted the lid of that crate was not what any of us expected. But looking back on it now, it was the only thing that made sense. He did not open the crate that afternoon. He looked at it, measured it with his eyes, roughly 2 feet wide, 3 feet long, 18 inches deep. Pine boards, old growth by the density of the grain. The tar along the seams had been applied in 2 coats. The second coat slightly darker than the first. That was the detail that stayed with him, not the crate. The second coat. His father had sealed this, walked away, thought about it, and come back. He set the floor section back in place, drove to the hardware store, bought a proper standing work light, a canvas tarp, cotton work gloves without grip coating, ate a sandwich in the truck, watching the light on the water. Then he went back in. He put on the work gloves. He got both hands under the crate and lifted. It was heavier than it looked. Considerably heavier. Not the weight of papers or fabric, the weight of something dense, something with mass. He had to reset his grip twice before he got it clear of the space and onto the tarp, and even then, he set it down harder than he intended, a controlled drop more than a placement, his lower back registering its opinion on the matter. He sat back and let his breathing settle. The crate was in front of him now in the full light of the work lamp. He could see the construction clearly. The boards were tight-fitted, no gaps, tongue and groove along the long sides. His father had built this. He recognized the joinery. It was the same joint Elton Webb had used on everything he built. The same spacing, the same corner notching, the same particular way the end grain was finished with a slight bevel that served no structural purpose, but which his father had done on every piece of woodwork Clarence could remember, as though the bevel was a signature. Elton had built it himself, had built it, sealed it, dropped it into the space he had cut in the floor of his own shop, and had put the floor back on top of it, and stained the edges, and gone on opening the shop every morning and selling bait and talking to fishermen and saying nothing to anyone. For how long, Clarence did not yet know. He looked at the top of the crate for a fastening. There was one, not a padlock, not a hasp. A wooden peg, hand-turned, fitted through a loop of heavy copper wire that wrapped around the crate twice and was twisted into itself at the back. The kind of closure that was not meant to be a lock. The kind that was meant to say, "I close this. It takes a decision to open it." He unwound the copper wire. It came away in his hands, stiff and green with age. He set it on the top beside him. He lifted the lid. The smell came first, cedar, and something else beneath it, something mineral and dry, the smell of paper that has been kept away from moisture for long enough that it has stabilized into its own particular stillness. And beneath that, faint and unmistakable, the same smell that lived in the walls of this shop, in the grain of every board, in the air itself, when you opened the door on a cool morning, salt and rubber, and the deep, cold water smell of a life lived on and near the bay. His father was in this smell. Clarence did not move for a moment. He simply knelt at the edge of the open crate and let the smell reach him, and understood, in the way that smell bypasses everything reasonable about a person and goes directly to the part that is not reasonable at all, that whatever was in here had been tended, had been cared for, had been put away with the same deliberateness with which his father had done everything. The bevel on the end grain, the second coat of tar, the specific weight of attention Elton Webb had given to things that mattered to him. Then he looked down. Inside the crate, packed in cedar shavings that had kept their color and their scent through what must have been decades of Gulf Coast humidity, there were 3 items. The first was a ledger. Black cover, cloth-bound, the spine reinforced with a strip of brown leather that had been stitched on by hand. His father's stitching, he knew those stitches, that same spacing, that same slight lean to the right. The second was a tin box. Flat, rectangular, the kind that had once held pipe tobacco, painted green with a small brass latch. It sat on top of a folded piece of oilcloth. The third was an envelope, thick, sealed with wax, actual sealing wax, red, pressed with something circular, a coin or a ring. His name was not on it. No name was on it. But it had been placed on top of everything else, which meant it was meant to be found first. He picked it up. The wax seal was intact. The envelope was heavy in his hand, not with paper, but with something inside that had weight and edge. He turned it over. Nothing on the back. The paper was good paper, the cream-colored kind, not office paper. His father had gone somewhere specific to buy this paper. He set it on the top and picked up the ledger. The cover was stiff. He opened it to the first page. His father's handwriting. The same compressed, slightly tilted script from the folder in the filing cabinet, the same script from the notes in the shop, from the tide table margin notes, from the birthday cards that had arrived every year without fail, until they stopped. At the top of the first page, in careful block letters, underlined twice, Franklin County Fishermen's Relief Fund. And below it, a date, March 14th, 1996, 28 years ago. Clarence read the first entry. It was not a dramatic entry. It was not a declaration or a manifesto. It was the kind of entry a man makes when he has decided something practical and has sat down to begin keeping track of it. Name, amount, date, circumstance. 4 columns ruled with a pencil and a straight edge, each line filled in the same compressed script, each entry complete. The first name was a man he recognized, Pete Alvarez. He had fished out of the bay his whole life, had lost his engine in the 1995 hurricane season, had been out of the water for almost a year before he got back running. Clarence had not known until this moment how Pete Alvarez had gotten back running. He had not known because the amount next to Pete Alvarez's name was listed as a loan from the fund, and the fund had no name attached to it in Pete's records, and Pete Alvarez had spent years, Clarence knew, trying to find out who had helped him.
He turned the page.
More names, more columns. He recognized most of them, men and women who had worked the bay his whole life, who had come into this shop and bought bait and talked about the weather, and whose boats he knew by sight. He found a family who had lost their boat in the 2004 season, when the redfish population collapsed and half the commercial fishermen in Franklin County went under. He found two brothers from East Point who had been in debt to a lender that was charging them rates that had no legal basis, and whom, according to a margin note, his father had helped remove from that situation by an unspecified arrangement in the spring of 2008.
He found a name he was not expecting.
He stopped at that page and stayed there. He read the entry twice. Then he put the ledger down on the top and sat very still on the floor of the shop with his hands in his lap and looked at the wall for a while.
The tide clock
Said 4:47 p.m. Outside, the light had shifted. The late afternoon sun was coming through the front window at the angle that turned the dust in the air into something visible, the way light does in old rooms at that hour, the way it makes you aware of how much is always floating there that you normally cannot see.
He was aware of his own breathing.
He was aware of the smell of cedar from the open crate. He was aware, in a way he had not been for some time, not since the morning Miriam had died in the hospital room at Tallahassee Memorial, and he had sat in the chair beside the bed and understood that some arrangements are final. Of the specific quality of silence that surrounds a thing that cannot be taken back.
His father had known.
All those years, his father had known and had kept it, and had built a place for it in the floor of his own shop, and had sealed it in, and had gone on every morning, opening the shop, pouring the bait, talking to the fishermen, saying nothing.
Clarence reached out
and picked up the envelope. He broke the wax seal. Inside the envelope was not a letter. Inside the envelope was a brass key and a folded card. The card was the same cream paper as the envelope. On it, in block letters, his father had written an address. A building on Commerce Street he knew, an office he had walked past 100 times. And below the address, 2 words.
Ask Donaldson.
Nothing else. He turned the card over. Blank. He held the key in his palm. Small. Brass. The kind that opened a safety deposit box, or a small lockbox, or a cabinet that had been built with the intention of holding something specific.
There was a number
stamped into the bow of the key. The number was 47. He looked at the tin box. He opened the brass latch and lifted the lid. Inside the tin box, packed in a folded square of oilcloth, were the documents. Not one document, a set of them, filed in order, paper-clipped in groups, each group with a cover sheet in his father's handwriting, noting the contents. He lifted the first group and read the cover sheet. Vessel registrations. 12 of them. He unclipped the cover sheet and looked at the first document. It was a boat registration. The vessel was a 22-foot flat-bottomed work skiff, the kind used for net fishing in shallow bay waters. The registration date was 2003. The registered owner was a name he knew, a man named Curtis Hale, who had been fishing the bay for his entire adult life, who had grown up in East Point, and whose family had never had the kind of money that bought boats outright. He looked at the purchase record clipped behind the registration. The buyer of record on the purchase was Elton Webb. He lifted the next group. Another vessel. Another name he knew. Another purchase record with his father's name as buyer. He went through all 12. 12 boats, 12 fishermen. His father's name on every purchase record, and then The registration transferred to the fisherman's name, in most cases within 6 months of purchase, in a few cases within 30 days, in one case the same week. His father had bought these men their boats, had bought them and transferred the title and said nothing, and the men had registered the boats in their own names and gone on fishing, and if any of them knew where the boats had come from, they had either kept that knowledge to themselves or had genuinely believed some other explanation. Clarence sat on the floor of the shop with the documents in his hands. The work light threw its flat, honest illumination across the tarp and the open crate and the cedar shavings and the ledger and the tin box and the brass key lying in his palm. And he sat in the middle of it and understood that he had been inside this shop 10,000 times in his life and had never once been inside it before. Not really. He had been inside a bait shop, a place that sold things. He had not known until now what the building had actually been for. He stayed on the floor until the light outside changed from afternoon to early evening. He was not reading anymore. He had read everything in the tin box, each document, each cover sheet, each registration and purchase record and transfer of title. He had set them back in order and re-clipped them the way he had found them, because they had been organized by someone who had organized them carefully, and that organization deserved to be maintained. He had the ledger open in his lap. He was not reading it either. He was holding it the way you hold a thing when you are not ready to put it down, and not ready to continue with it with both hands. At rest, the way you might hold a tool at the end of a long day, when the work is not finished, but the light has gone, and you have done everything the light allowed. He turned to the first page again. March 14th, 1996. He tried to remember what he had been doing in March of 1996. 44 years old, still fishing commercially. He and Miriam married 21 years. While Clarence was hauling mullet out of the bay, Elton Webb had sat down in the back room of this shop and ruled 4 columns in a black ledger and written the date at the top of the first page and begun keeping track. 28 years. He had kept track for 28 years. The ledger was 240 pages. He had not counted, he had riffled the pages and estimated, and his estimate was 240, give or take. Not all the pages were full. The entries became less frequent in the later years, which made sense when you considered that his father had been in his late 70s by then, and the entries themselves grew shorter, not in the information they contained, but in the handwriting, which compressed further as the years went on. The letters smaller and closer together. The way handwriting changes when the hand that makes it is no longer entirely reliable, but the mind that directs it is still precise. The last entry was dated 11 months before Elton Webb died. A family named Okafor. A boat motor. $3,400. Below it, in the smallest handwriting in the ledger, a single sentence. I believe this is the last one I will be able to do directly. That was all. No signature. No closing. Just that sentence, and then the rest of the page, blank. And then all the pages after it, blank. And then the back cover. Clarence read that sentence 4 times. Then he turned back to the beginning and started doing the arithmetic he had been avoiding. He did not want to use his phone. That felt wrong. He did it in pencil, in the margin of the back cover, column by column, the way he had kept accounts on a commercial boat for 30 years. Direct payments. Boat purchases, engine repairs, fuel. 2 entries marked medical, direct. He carried the figures forward and checked them twice. He sat back and looked at the total. $312,448. 00. $312,000. Over 28 years. From a bait shop on Water Street. He looked around the shop. He thought about the tide clock, the hand-lettered sign, the tackle cases that had been dusted and organized by someone, the floor that had been swept, the tape on the cracked window that had been replaced. His father had been open every day for 51 years.
Not most days.
Every day. He had been open the week his wife had her hip replaced. He had been open the month after Clarence's mother died. He had been open through 4 hurricanes. Not the direct ones, but the seasonal ones that came every few years and kept the boats in and kept the tourists away and kept the money from moving the way money needs to move in a small coastal town. He had been open because the shop had to be open. Not for the customers, though the customers mattered, because the shop was the engine of something else, and engines do not run when they are not running.
47 families.
He did not know that number yet. Not precisely, he had not counted the entries in the ledger, had only estimated. But the tin box had told him. 47 vessel registrations, 12 direct boat purchases, and the key with the number 47 stamped into the brass.
He looked at the key lying on the top.
Ask Donaldson. If you've made it this far into Clarence's story, hit subscribe. Because what I found in that office on Commerce Street, what Donaldson had been holding for 11 years, is the part I have been waiting to tell you. He went to Commerce Street the next morning. He had slept in the shop. Not on purpose, not with any particular intention. He had sat on the floor with the ledger too long, and by the time he was ready to move, it was past midnight, and the drive back to the motel on Highway 98 felt like a distance he was not prepared to cover. He had found a canvas tarp in the back room and folded it and put it under his head, and lain on the floor of the shop where his father had stood every morning for 51 years, and looked at the ceiling and listened to the bay.
He had slept better than he had slept in 2 years.
He woke at 5:47 a.m. to the sound of a pelican landing on the dock outside. He made coffee in the thermos and drank it on the front step, and watched the bay go from black to grey to the particular thin gold of early morning on the Gulf Coast, the light that belongs only to this latitude and this hour, and which he had not seen in 6 years, and had missed, without knowing what exactly he was missing, for all of that time. Then he drove to Commerce Street. Donaldson was a real estate attorney. He had been a real estate attorney in Apalachicola for 34 years, and he was, as it turned out, exactly the kind of man you would expect to find at the other end of a brass key stamped with the number 47. Measured, precise, unhurried, with the particular composure of a man who has been holding things in trust for a long time, and has learned to be patient about it.
He was 70 years old.
He had known Elton Webb for most of those years. He looked at the key. He looked at Clarence. He said, "I was wondering when you'd come." He said it without reproach, without drama, the way a man says a thing he has been carrying for a while and is glad to set down. He led Clarence to a room in the back of the office, a room with a wall of small metal doors, each numbered, each with a brass lock. He found door 47. He stepped aside. Clarence put the key in the lock. It turned on the first try. Inside the box were 3 items. The first was a bank statement. Not a current statement, a summary statement, the kind a trust officer prepares when an account reaches a significant milestone. The account was held at Gulf Coast Community Bank. The account number was one Clarence did not recognize. The name on the account was Franklin County Fishermen's Relief Fund, in trust. The balance on the summary statement, prepared at the time of Elton Webb's death and updated by the bank at 11 months following, was $312,000.
00.
Clarence looked at the number. $312,000. The same number he had calculated from the ledger. His father had replaced every dollar he had given out.
He read that again in his mind.
Slowly, the way you read something when you are not sure you have understood it correctly, and you want to make sure. Every family that had received money from the fund, every boat that had been purchased, every engine repaired and fuel bought and medical expense covered, his father had put the money back, not in the accounts of the people who had received it, back into the fund, so that the fund remained whole, so that the 28 years of giving had not diminished the capacity to give. The fund was self-sustaining. It had been designed to continue after him. He was not executor. He understood that immediately his name was not on the statement in that capacity. He looked at the second item in the box, which was a legal document, and he found his name there. He was the trustee. He had been named as trustee 11 years ago, when his father had filed the trust documents, before anyone knew Elton Webb was sick, before any of the conversations about the estate that came later, before Derek had made any plans about what he would do with what he was going to receive. His father had done this quietly and early, and had locked it in a numbered box, and had left a key in a sealed crate under the floor of the shop, and had gone on opening the shop every morning because the shop was still the engine, and the engine still needed to run. Clarence stood at the metal wall with the document in his hands. Donaldson was behind him, quiet. He read the trust document through once. Then he set it on the small shelf beside the open box and picked up the third item. It was a photograph. Not old, it had been taken with a digital camera, printed on glossy paper, the colors still accurate. It showed the shop, taken from across Water Street, from the sidewalk, on a morning when the light was low and the bay was visible in the background past the dock. In the doorway of the shop, just visible through the open front door, a figure stood at the counter. His father. Old, in the photograph, the stooped shoulders, the white hair under the cap, but standing the way Elton Webb always stood behind a counter, the way that was not quite at rest and not quite at attention, but something between the two, a readiness, a quality of being present to whatever walked through the door. Clarence looked at the photograph for a long time. He looked at the bay in the background. He looked at the sign over the door, Webb's Bait and Tackle, the letters small in the photograph but legible. Then he looked at the bottom right corner of the photograph, where someone had written in ballpoint pen, in handwriting that was not his father's. He was here every day. 47 years. Not 28. Not the years of the fund. 47. Clarence turned the photograph over. On the back, in his father's handwriting, 4 words. You were always here. He did not understand it immediately. He stood at the metal wall and looked at those 4 words and did not understand what they meant. And the not understanding was not a comfortable sensation. It was the particular discomfort of standing at the edge of something that has your name on it, but that you cannot yet see clearly. He asked Donaldson. Donaldson was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Your father told me you came to the shop every Saturday until you were 12 years old. You swept the floor. You sorted the bait. You stacked the buckets. You didn't know you were working. You thought you were just there. Clarence said, I remember that. Donaldson said, He said that was when he knew. Clarence said, Knew what? Donaldson said, That you were the one who understood what the shop was for. He said it simply, without emphasis, the way you say something that is true, and that has been true for a long time, and that does not require decoration. Clarence looked at the photograph. He looked at the figure in the doorway, the readiness in the posture, the quality of being present. He thought about every Saturday morning from age 6 to age 12, the drive to the shop with his father, the smell of the place, the bait tanks running, the sorting and the sweeping and the stacking. He had not thought of those mornings in decades. They had been ordinary. They had been Saturdays. They had been the unremarkable fabric of a childhood in which certain things were simply what you did. He had not known, sweeping that floor at age 7, age 8, age 9, that he was being recognized.
He had not known that recognition was happening.
And yet, and here is the part I did not see coming. Not the money, not the ledger, not even the photograph.
What Clarence found,
When he sat with all of it, what it actually meant, that his father had done this for 28 years without telling a single person, changed the whole shape of what he thought he was going to do next.
he thought about what he had felt.
Walking into the shop 3 days ago, the specific pull of the place, the feeling of something unfinished, the way the smell had reached him before anything else,
He thought about the ledger,
and the 47 families, and the 12 boats, and the $312,000 that had been put back, dollar by dollar, over 28 years, so that it would still be whole when the right person came to find it.
he thought about the second coat of tar.
Derek drove down from Pensacola 2 days later. Clarence did not know he was coming. He found out when he heard the truck in the gravel lot at 10 in the morning and looked out the front window and saw his son sitting in the cab for a moment before getting out.
Derek came through the door.
And stood just inside it. He looked at the shop, the work light, the tarp on the floor that Clarence had not moved, the ledger on the counter, closed, with the tin box beside it.
He looked at the opening in the floor.
Clarence had left it uncovered, the space still visible, the cedar shavings scattered at the edges, the 2 runners sitting on the dirt below.
He looked at all of it
The way a man looks at a place he thought he understood and is now not sure about. He said, "I heard from Donaldson."
Clarence said,
"I know." Derek walked to the counter. He looked at the ledger. He did not touch it. He said, "I didn't know any of this was here." Clarence said, "Neither did I."
Derek looked at the tin box.
He looked at the opening in the floor. He was quiet for a long time. Then he reached out and picked up the ledger.
He opened it to the first page.
He read the date, March 14th, 1996, and the 4 columns and the first entry. Pete Alvarez. He turned one page.
He turned another.
He set it down. He did not close it. He looked at the opening in the floor again. He said, "He built this himself." Clarence said, "Yes."
Derek put his truck keys on the counter.
He picked them up again. He looked at the sign above the door, Webb's Bait and Tackle. The letters faded to the color of the morning sky.
He said,
"I was looking at what was there. I wasn't looking at what it was for." He said it the way a man says something he has been working toward for several days and has finally arrived at the accurate version of.
not an apology.
Not a retraction. The correct sentence, said plainly, without decoration. Clarence did not say anything. Derek looked at the ledger one more time. He looked at the opening in the floor.
He did not look at Clarence.
Then he picked up his keys and walked back to his truck. Clarence watched him pull out of the gravel lot and turn south on Water Street. He stood behind the counter for a while. The shop was quiet. The tide clock marked 10:31 a.m. Outside, the bay went on doing what it had always done, indifferent to what had just been said in here, indifferent to what had not been said, moving in its own direction, regardless.
Derek called that afternoon.
He called at 2:17 p.m., and his voice had the particular quality it had when he had been thinking about something long enough that he had moved past impatience into a kind of performed reasonableness that was worse than impatience.
He said,
"I've been trying to reach you." Clarence said, "I know." Derek said, "The developer is asking for a timeline. He needs to know if we're moving forward." Clarence said, "We're not."
There was a pause.
Derek said, "Dad." Clarence said, "The building is not for sale, Derek." Derek said, "You can't just—" He stopped. He started again. He said, "You don't understand the situation I'm in.
This isn't about what either of us wants.
I have actual obligations." Clarence said. I know you do. Derek said. Then you understand why Clarence said, I'll send you a number to call.
A financial advisor in Tallahassee.
Tell him your situation. He'll help you find a way through. Derek said. I don't need, Clarence said. Take the number, Derek. Another pause.
Derek did not say anything for a moment.
Clarence heard him breathing, heard him working through whatever he was working through, the calculations of a man who has planned something carefully and is finding that the plan has met something that does not move.
Then Derek said,
Who's paying for it? It was not quite a question. It was the thing a man says when he has begun to understand that there are parts of a situation he was not told about, and he is not sure yet how many parts there are or how significant they are, and he is asking in a way that allows him to retreat if the answer is something he cannot absorb all at once.
Clarence said,
Your grandfather. The silence after that had a different quality than the silences before it. Clarence did not fill it. He had learned from years on the water, from years behind a counter, from years beside a man who had spent 51 of them standing in a doorway, watching what walked in, that some silences are not fulfilling. Some silences are for the person inside them to find their own way out of. Derek eventually said he would take the number. Clarence gave it to him. He said goodbye.
He ended the call.
He stood at the window of the shop and looked at the bay. He did not tell anyone what he had found. Not immediately. Not in the days that followed, which were full enough without telling there was Donaldson to meet with twice more. There were trust documents to review. There was a conversation with the bank that lasted 2 hours and covered ground he had not known existed.
There was the matter of the fund itself,
which was not complicated in principle and was considerably complicated in practice because a trust that has been operating informally for 28 years and that now needs to be formalized and administered and continued is not a simple thing to set up correctly.
Donaldson knew what was needed.
He had been waiting to begin. There was the shop. He had not decided anything about the shop, not formally. He had told Derek the building was not for sale, and that was as far as the decision extended.
What the building was for,
what it would become, what it meant to be the trustee of a fund that his father had built in secret over nearly 3 decades. Those were not questions he could answer from a motel room on Highway 98.
Those were questions that required
presence. He called the motel and extended his stay by 2 weeks. Then he extended it again. Tommy Garland came every morning. He came at the same time, roughly 8 o'clock, and he brought the same paper bag from the bakery on Avenue D, and he sat in the same chair, and they drank coffee and said what there was to say and were quiet when there was nothing to say, which was often. Tommy did not ask what Clarence had found under the floor. He did not ask what was in the tin box or what Donaldson had said or what was going to happen with the building. He came and sat and drank his coffee, the way he had been coming and sitting and drinking coffee in this shop for 30 years. One morning, about 2 weeks after Clarence had lifted the floor section and found the crate, Tommy said, You know, Pete Alvarez always thought it was the diocese.
Clarence said,
What? Tommy said, The money he got for his engine after the 95 season. He always thought it came from the diocese, from some kind of Catholic relief fund. He lit a candle at St. Patrick's every year for 15 years. He said this without particular emphasis, looking at the tide clock. Clarence said, He know now? Tommy said, Somebody told him. He did not say who had told him. He did not say how the word had gotten out, or how much of the word had gotten out, or what form it had taken when it reached Pete Alvarez. He just said somebody told him, and then he drank the rest of his coffee, and the subject closed itself the way subjects close in small towns, where everyone already knows most of it, and the remaining details fill in gradually, without ceremony. He opened the shop on a Monday. He did not announce it. He turned on the lights, 3 of the 4, the same 3 that had come on the first morning, and unlocked the front door and put the sign his father had kept in the window, the handwritten cardboard one that said, "Open," and he sat down on the stool behind the counter.
He did not have bait yet.
The tanks were not running. He had nothing to sell. By 7:30 a.m., there were two men standing outside looking at the sign. He let them in.
They were fishermen.
They had known his father. They did not ask about the estate, or about Derek, or about any of the things that Clarence had been bracing for.
They asked about the tides.
They asked about the mullet run. They sat in the chairs along the wall and drank coffee from their own thermoses and talked about the water, the way men talk about the water when they have nowhere particular to be, and the morning is good, and the company is sufficient. At 9:15 a.m., a woman came in. She was 60-something, weathered in the same honest way the building was weathered. She looked around the shop. She looked at the sign above the door.
She said,
"I didn't think anyone was going to open this back up." Clarence said, "It's open." She nodded. She bought a spool of leader line she probably didn't need. She counted out exact change on the counter, coins from the bottom of her purse, and set them down one by one. She looked at Clarence once more before she left.
She said,
"It's good." That was all. Clarence put the coins in the register. The register was the same one his father had used for 30 years, mechanical, the kind that rang a bell when you pressed the keys.
The bell worked.
He had not known it still worked until that morning. He stood behind the counter and listened to it. The dinner was not Clarence's idea. It was, as best he could determine, nobody's idea specifically. It was the kind of thing that happens in a small coastal town when a story has been circulating for long enough that people need somewhere to put it. The story had been circulating for 3 weeks by then. The details were not all accurate. Some of the figures were wrong. Some of the names had been transposed. One version had Clarence discovering the crate on his first day in the shop rather than his third, and another version had the fund containing substantially more money than it did, which Clarence corrected when asked, and which people seemed faintly disappointed to have corrected. But the broad shape of the story was right, and the broad shape was enough. Someone had used Elton Webb's shop without his knowledge. Someone had been given money without knowing where it came from. Someone had been handed the keys to something much larger than a bait shop. The dinner happened at the Apalachicola Seafood Grill on Market Street, a Tuesday evening in November, and Clarence had not organized it and had not invited anyone, and had been told about it by Tommy on the Monday, with the same casual brevity Tommy applied to everything. He said, "People want to see you Tuesday. Seafood Grill. 7 o'clock. Clarence said, "How many people?" Tommy said, "Some." Some turned out to be 63. He arrived at 6:45 p.m., and the room was already full.
Not loud full.
The particular fullness of a room where people who know each other have gathered for a specific reason and are in the process of deciding how to be in the room together.
Some people were at tables.
Some were standing along the wall. He recognized most of the faces, not all by name, but by the quality of recognition that belongs to a town you grew up in. The way a face can be familiar for 30 years without the name ever quite attaching to it.
Pete Alvarez was there.
He was 71 years old now, and he looked it, the way men who have fished hard look their age, honestly, without apology. He was sitting at a table near the window with two other men Clarence knew from the bay. And when Clarence came in, Pete stood up, not quickly, the way you stand for ceremony, but steadily, the way you stand when standing is the right thing, and you know it without being told.
He said,
"I've been trying to figure out for 29 years who fixed my engine." He said it directly, without preamble, without the cushioning that people put around things they've been carrying a long time.
just the fact of it.
Clarence said, "My father fixed your engine." Pete said, "I know that now." He did not say anything else. He sat back down. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at Clarence. He said, "I lit a candle at St. Patrick's every year." Clarence said, "I heard that." Pete said, "I'm going to keep lighting it." He said it with a firmness that was not quite defiance and not quite grief, and was in fact something Clarence did not have a word for. The quality of a man who has decided that the direction of his gratitude does not need to change simply because the address of it has been corrected.
Clarence nodded. He sat down.
Others came to the table as the evening went on. An older woman, whose name Clarence did not catch at first, who sat down across from him and folded her hands on the table and looked at him for a moment before speaking.
She said,
"I always thought it was a government program, one of those rural development things. I never looked into it because the money came when we needed it, and it was enough, and we were busy trying to stay afloat."
She paused.
She said, "We named our second boat after the program. We called her Gulf Relief. She's still running." She said this as though it were a piece of information she needed to put somewhere, and Clarence was the right place to put it. He said, "That's a good name for a boat." She said, "It is now." He stayed until past 10. He had not planned to stay that long. He was not by nature a man for long evenings in crowded rooms. He preferred the early mornings, the hour before the light was fully established, the particular quality of being the only person awake in a place that would soon have people in it. But the room did not feel crowded in the way he had expected. It felt instead like the particular case of a room that has been waiting for a conversation to happen in it, and is relieved, now that the conversation is happening, to be used for what it was made for. Near the end of the evening, a young man sat down beside him. He was, Clarence estimated, 28 or 29 years old. He had the build of someone who worked physically, the hands of someone who worked on the water. He introduced himself as Marcus Reyes. He said his father had received a boat from the fund, not a registration transfer, a direct gift, one of the 12. He had grown up on that boat.
He was fishing it still.
He said, "I didn't know until last week. My father didn't know where it came from. He told us he'd won it in a card game, which none of us believed, but we let it stand because he believed it, or acted like he believed it, and it made him happy to believe it."
He paused.
He said, "He died 3 years ago. He never found out." Clarence said, "I'm sorry." Marcus said, "Don't be. He fished that boat for 20 years. He put 3 of us through school on what he made from it. If he'd known, he would have spent the rest of his life trying to pay it back. And the man who gave it to him didn't want it paid back." He said it with a certainty that was not assumption. It was the certainty of someone who has thought about a thing from all the angles available to him and has arrived at the correct one.
Clarence looked at him.
He said, "How do you know that?" Marcus said, "Because he put the boats in our names. If he'd wanted it back, he wouldn't have done that."
Clarence sat with that for a moment.
He said, "No, he wouldn't have." Marcus said, "What are you going to do with the shop?" Clarence looked toward the window. Outside, Commerce Street was quiet, in the way it was always quiet this late, the particular settled quiet of a small town after the evening's business is done. He said, "Keep it open." Marcus said, "Yeah." He said it as though this were not news, as though this were the answer that anyone paying attention would have arrived at, and the question had been a formality. Then he stood up and shook Clarence's hand and said it was good to meet him. Clarence drove back to the shop afterward. He did not go inside immediately. He parked in the gravel lot and sat in the truck with the windows down and listened to the bay. The tide was going out. He could hear it in the small sounds at the dock, the particular settle and creak of lines adjusting, the intermittent, soft knock of a fender against a piling, the way the water sounds when it is moving away from a place and taking its weight with it. He thought about the second coat of tar. He had been thinking about it, in the background of everything else, since the morning he had opened the crate. Not with urgency, the way you think about a detail that you know means something and that you are content to let resolve itself at its own pace. His father had sealed the crate,
Had waited.
had thought about it, had come back and sealed it again. He had wanted to be certain. Not certain that the crate would hold the first coat would have been sufficient for that, and Elton Webb was a man who knew what a first coat would hold. The second coat was not structural. It was something else. It was the act of a man who had put something important away and had later come back to check on it. Not because he doubted it, but because the checking was part of the caring. Because the things worth keeping deserve more than one visit. He sat in the truck for a long time. Then he got out and unlocked the door and went inside. He turned on the work light and sat down behind the counter on the stool his father had kept there. The tall wooden stool with the cracked vinyl seat that he had recovered once, years ago, and had never gotten around to recovering again. He could feel through the vinyl the shape of the wood beneath it, the particular worn contour of a seat that had been sat in the same way by the same person for many years. He reached under the counter and found, in the spot where his father had always kept it, a yellow legal pad and a pen. He pulled it out. He set it on the counter in front of him. He looked at the blank page. He was not sure yet what he needed to write. He knew the fund needed administration. He knew there were letters to send, and not all the people who needed to receive them would be easy to find, and some of them might not be ready for what the letters said. He knew the shop needed work. The roof, the window, the bait tanks that had not run in 3 years, but that could run again with new pumps and new aerators, and the particular kind of attention that mechanical things require when they have been left too long. He knew Tommy Garland would be here at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning with a paper bag from the bakery on Avenue D. He knew Marcus Reyes was still on the water, running a 22-foot flat-bottomed skiff that his father had believed he won in a card game, and that the boat was still earning, still working, still doing what it had been purchased to do a long time ago by a man who had not wanted to be thanked for it. He picked up the pen. At the top of the first page of the legal pad, he wrote the date. Then he drew 4 columns. He ruled them the same way his father had ruled them, with a straight edge, pencil, clean lines. Name, amount, date, circumstance. He capped the pen and set it down. He looked at the columns he had drawn. They were empty. They were supposed to be empty. This was the beginning. He sat behind the counter until nearly midnight. He did not write anything in the columns. He did not need to yet. But he left the legal pad open on the counter under the work light, the 4 columns waiting, and he turned off the lamp and went to the back room and lay down on the canvas tarp he had left folded there, and he looked at the ceiling in the dark, and he listened to the bay doing what the bay does, moving, adjusting, neither still nor violent, just continuously and reliably present. And he felt, for the first time in longer than he could accurately remember, that he was in the right place. Not a place that was finished, a place that was ready to continue. Outside, the tide was coming back in. By morning, it would have returned to the dock, and Tommy would come with coffee and biscuits and sit in the chair beside the counter, and the shop would smell the way it always smelled, and somewhere out on the bay, Marcus Reyes would be running his nets in the early light on a boat that had been given without condition by a man he never met. And somewhere in the ledger that sat on the shelf above the open crate, 47 entries waited to be found by the families who had received help and had spent years not knowing where it came from. And some of them would want to know, and some of them would not. And both responses were correct, and none of it required Clarence to decide anything this morning.
He only needed to open the shop.
The same as every morning for 51 years. The same as the morning after that. A fisherman knows that what lives beneath the surface is always larger than what you can see from the boat. Elton Webb spent 28 years proving that generosity works exactly the same way. He did not do it to be remembered. He did not do it to be found. He did it because the water was cold and the seasons were hard, and the people on it were worth more than the seasons gave them. And someone needed to know that, and he had decided in March of 1996 that someone would be him. What Clarence inherited was not a bait shop. It was a practice, the practice of looking at what is beneath the surface and deciding, without asking for recognition, to make it larger. If this story stayed with you today, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for a new story every week, and leave a comment. Have you ever been helped by someone who never told you it was them?